Hello everyone, and welcome to the 14th video in the TypeScript Game Engine tutorial series. So as you may recall, in the last video we stood up file loading for zones, and we actually have our zone loading up and our sim objects stood up, but we don't actually have anything displayed on the screen because we aren't loading components. So that is actually what I want to address in this video. So in this video we're going to add everything that's needed to load the components along with the objects in the scene. And yeah, so let's get started with that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to figure out is what we actually need to include in this file for the components to actually be loaded. Our first and really our only component that we have at the moment is our sprite component. We need two things. We need a name and a material name. So this is going to be very easy to load from a file. The name, of course, is the name of the component itself, and then the material name is the name of the material it's going to be using. Now, materials for right now are stood up by the engine. This is something we're eventually going to want to move. However, I'm not going to move that right now. I want to keep this nice and simple, and I'm actually probably going to handle this separately. So for right now, I'm going to leave this where it is and just handle the actual loading of the sprite component. What we actually want to do is for each one of these components, we want to create two more classes. And since we only have one component right now, this is not going to be a very widespread change. So we want to export class, and we're going to call this Sprite component data. Oops. So we'll call that Sprite component data. And it's going to have a public name string, right? So that's going to match up with the name here. And it's going to have a public, God, I can't type tonight. It's going to have a public material name string. And then we're going to have a public set from JSON method. Just going to pass JSON, type any, return type void. And this is basically going to say if JSON.name is not equal undefined, this.name equals JSON.name. And let's cast that to a string. I can't type tonight for some reason. Okay. And I'm just going to copy this same logic for material name. Okay. And for right now, I'm not going to do any error checking. I'm probably going to want to go back and change this in a bit, but I'm actually going to have to change this a little bit anyways in the near future. So I'm just going to leave this as is for right now. So we basically just need a way to set this easily from JSON. And the next thing we're going to need is we're going to need a builder. So we're going to say export class sprite component builder. And before I move on, we really should be creating some interfaces for this. So I'm going to go ahead and set those up now. And you'll see why here in a second. So I'm actually going to create call one IComponentData. And this is going to be namespace TSE export interface IComponentData. Right, and this is just going to have a name of type string, and it's going to have set from JSON any, return type void. That's all that one's going to include. I'm going to create another one, and we're going to call this IComponentData builder, namespace TSE, export interface IComponent builder. Okay, and this one is going to include a read-only type, and it's going to be of type string. We'll get back to that in a minute. And then it's also going to include a public method. Well, that's obviously going to be public if it's an interface. It's going to be a method called build from JSON. And we're going to pass it JSON any, and it's going to return a we actually need one more, but I jumped the gun a little bit here. One more TypeScript file. We need IComponent space TSE export interface IComponent. And this is just going to have name type string. No, that's good enough for now. Okay. So in the builder, it's going to return a IComponent. Okay. And so in our Sprite component, this is going to implement IComponentData. This is going to implement IComponentBuilder. And we're actually going to go to base component, and it is going to implement IComponent. Okay. The other thing that we're going to change is we're going to add in base component excuse me. We're going to add in base component new protected property, and we're going to call this _data, and it's going to hold a IComponentData. And the constructor is going to be changed from taking a name to taking data, which is IComponentData. And then it's going to say this.data equals data. And then it's automatically going to set this.name equals data.name. Okay, so we automatically get that for free whenever we pass that in. Okay, let's go ahead and move this over here. Okay, now, Sprite component, let's see, set from JSON. Oops, did I mess that up? Yep, I misspelled that. Okay, let me go back there and fix that. Okay. Let's implement this interface. So, public. We're going to set this to a getter. And we're going to return Sprite. And this will make more sense. Actually, let me put that back to where it was. It makes sense to be there. Okay, this will make more sense in a little bit. Basically, what this is saying is for whatever is going to be looking at this, this is the type that this builder handles. So, if you haven't guessed this already, what this is going to do is this builder is going to be taking a section of the data and constructing a component using the data. And the reason that we want to do that is because we can attach any number of these builders to our engine, and they're all completely separated from one another. They're not reliant on each other in any way, shape, or form. They're completely decoupled, and it makes the engine extensible and reusable. So if you want to add a new component that does something completely different, you can do that, and you don't have to change any of the existing code that actually looks at or loads any of this stuff. That's why we're using these interfaces. And I'll show you how all these pieces connect here in a few minutes. So the first thing that we want to do is, let's just finish off our builder. So change this to public, and our build from JSON is simply going to do, so we'll say let data equals new Sprite component data. Okay. And we want to say data.set from JSON, and we want to pass the JSON. And then we want to return, whoops, can't do that yet. So in the Sprite component, we actually need to change a couple things here. So we need to say data, and then we need to say IComponentData, and then pass to the super data, oops, so that it meets that criteria. And then, actually, instead of IComponentData, this should be Sprite component data. And when we create the sprite, we're actually going to say data.materialName. Right? So we're making use of the properties that are created in here. Okay? And so now we can say return new Sprite component, and we can pass it data. And so now this only cares about taking the data that's passed to it, letting this class extract what it needs from it, and letting this class take what was extracted and do something with it. And so all these things are completely separated from one another, and the pieces of logic and the core concerns are separated in a way that is reusable and extensible, and in a way where if one piece breaks, we're not going to have to rewrite the whole thing. Now, how does all this stuff get used? We're actually going to need something in components that makes use of all this stuff. So we're going to create a component manager. Okay, so we're going to say namespace TSE, and we're going to export class component manager. And all this is going to keep track of is these different builders. So we're going to say private static registered builders. And that's going to be a key value pair dictionary. So we're going to say type string, and we're going to say IComponentBuilder. And we're going to set that to an empty object. Okay? And then we're going to create a public static register builder. And this is going to take in a builder. And it's going to be a IComponent builder rather. Turn type void. And now I can say component manager underscore registered builders. And for the type, I'll say builder.type equals builder. So now you can see where we're actually using that type right here. So this is actually used in the dictionary that is defined here. And so now the next thing that I need to create here is another public static, and I'll call this extract component, and I'll pass it some JSON, right? And that's of type any because JSON is not really specific. And I want to return an IComponent. And so what this is going to do is it's going to look at the component manager registered builders, and it's going to look at their type. So the way that this is going to have to work is it's actually going to have to examine the JSON first for type. So we want to say if that's not undefined, then we do this other stuff. Else, we want to throw an error. And we want to say component manager error type is missing. Okay? So basically, if we don't have a type, we can't process this. If we do have a type, then we want to say string JSON.type. So in other words, if there's a builder registered for that type, and it's not equal to undefined, right? Then what we want to do is return that builder.build from JSON and pass it the JSON. Okay, so basically, if this doesn't exist, in fact, you know what? We actually don't even need this else block here. We just always want to throw an error if this doesn't work. Type is missing, or builder is not registered for this type. Okay? So, let's see. Why is this bleating? Somehow wound up with a missing thing there. Okay. So now we can just say component manager extract component and pass it some JSON. And it looks through the registered builders and finds one that can handle that type, and then go ahead and process it and return that by building it from JSON. So, as you may have guessed, since we have this component manager register builder, we actually need to call that from somewhere. We need to register it. And I don't want to have to say component manager.register builder from all over the place in code. I want to just include it with this sort of as a package, right? So when you're developing a component, you just sort of do everything in one place. In this case, I'm just doing it in one file since it's a really simple component. I may split them out later, but for right now, I'm just going to put everything in one file. So all I have to do is say component manager dot register builder, and I can say new Sprite component builder, and that's it. So when this file is executed, it will automatically be registered. Why is this throwing an error? Use before its declaration. Okay. So anytime, sometimes you'll wind up getting this. All you have to do is basically just grab the file that it's missing, drag and drop it here, and it'll just add a reference to the top there. And that should resolve the error. There we go. Okay. So now this builder is automatically registered, so anytime we run into anything that is of type Sprite in our zone file, it will go ahead and stand up a Sprite. Great. So that should be everything that is needed to actually handle the loading. The next thing that needs to happen is in the zone itself, we need to add some code to actually call this. So before we do that, we need to figure out where in here we actually want this data to live, right? So we have our objects, and then in our objects we have our name, the transform, and children. And this, I think, is, for right now, the best place for this to live is right at this level, at the object level. And so what I'm actually going to do is in the object, I'm going to say, I'm going to create another one called components. and that's going to be an array. And here is where I'm actually going to create those definitions. So it's going to, again, be an array of objects. And this is going to be the name of the component. So let's take a look at our test zone here. So if we look at our Sprite component, this was actually the name and then the material name, which is the two pieces of data we're going to need. I'm actually going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it here. And I'm going to say name is test, and then I'll say material name is crate. Great. And the last piece of data that we're going to need is the type, and that's going to be Sprite. So this Sprite lines up with our Sprite components builder's type. So once we have that, this should have everything that it needs to actually go ahead and stand that up. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a copy of this, because I actually want a copy of this component in the child as well. And I'm just going to paste it. And you can see why this might be a little bit much to manage in the future. So we're going to need to come up with a reusable way to handle this so that we don't have all this duplicated data all over the place. But for right now, this will work just fine. So we have our components. So now we need to actually just load them. And we can actually load them right in the same code where we're actually standing up the sim object itself. And so what we're going to want to do is, in the sim object itself, in the load sim object, I'm going to say before we actually handle the children, we're going to go ahead and set up the components. So let's go ahead and say if data section dot components is not equal undefined. Then we're going to say for let c of, let's say in data section dot components, and we'll just say let data equals data section dot components index c. And so now we can say component manager dot extract component data, right? So, and we'll set that to, so we'll say component equals component manager dot extract component. And we'll say here if, actually we don't need to check undefined, because this should never return undefined. It's actually going to error out if it doesn't have some way to handle that. So we don't need to perform that kind of check here. What I can do is I can say sim object dot add component component. And that's it. That's all we have to do to actually add the component. Oh, okay. So this is actually, this is exposed a slight issue here. So you'll see that the add component takes type base component, but I'm passing in IComponent here. So we actually need to update the definition of SimObject add component. And I suspect this is going to be an issue in a few places. So our components actually need to be a collection of I components. Let's see, add component needs to be, take type I component. Okay. And IComponent does not have SetOwner, so we need to add that. And for that we can just say, we'll just say owner SimObject of type void. Okay. Back to SimObject. So we need to actually add load, update, and render, and unload to our component. So let's actually look at base component here, because base component will actually give us an idea of everything that needs to be added. So I'm just going to copy all this. And I'm going to paste it here. So this is going to turn into a read-only owner. SetOwner we already have. Let's move that up here. We have a load, it's type void. We have an update, that's also type void. And a render, that's also type void. And since this is an interface, we get rid of the public flags. And let's just fix some of the spacing. There, we should be good. So now if I go back to SimObject, all of our errors are seemingly gone. So let's rebuild this. Okay. And our test zone is actually a problem now because it's doing things the way that we're not supposed to really be doing them anymore. So I'm actually just going to comment out this entire file. And in case you're wondering how I did that, I just Control-A to select all, and then you press and hold Control, and then press and release K, press and release C. So Control-KC. Okay, and as you can see, I just did it again, and it actually commented it twice, so I'm actually going to undo that. But that's just a quick keyboard shortcut for commenting code. Anyway, so we don't need test zone anymore, so I'm actually just going to comment that out. We'll keep it now for reference, but we're actually going to wind up removing that in the very near future. Okay, so let's rebuild this and run. And we don't have anything showing. Interesting. So the zone manager is, its active zone is undefined. So why is the active zone undefined? So we have load zone. Let's go ahead and just set a let's just create a debug message here to make sure that that code is actually being called. I have a feeling it's not being. Okay, so the load zone should be kicked off by either receiving this message or if the asset is already loaded, it should be... Oh, okay. This check I think is wrong. It should be not equal to -1. So in other words, if this is found, then that should be called. I'm actually going to create a console.log there as well. And let's just say message.code. We'll just spit out the message code. Okay. And let's run this again. There we go. Okay, that's what it was. It's funny how sometimes little things like that can trip you up. But as you can see, we are now loading up our components. They show up as we expect, and they are parented as we expect. You'll note also that we don't have the rotation that we had before, because that was actually a special thing that was happening in test zone, and we actually need a new mechanism to handle that. So that is actually going to be where I'm going to end this video. So now that we have zones loading up from files like this, things are going to get a whole lot simpler to actually test and configure and iterate. So this is where I'm going to go ahead and end this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned from it. And I will see you guys in the next video.